Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at the base model 2017 21.5 inch iMac. We're going to look at how this performs today using Catalina, which at the time of this video is the latest operating system available from Apple. We're going to look at the specs, some benchmarking. I'm going to talk a little bit about video recording and day-to-day usage. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about something that's awesome on this machine in terms of upgradability. Now, as we're going through this video, if you have any questions or comments on anything I talk about, leave those down in the comment section below. And with that out of the way, let's get into some of the specs on this machine. The CPU is an i5-7400, which is a quad-core processor. It's got 8 gigs of DDR4 RAM, a 1 terabyte Fusion drive. Those Fusion drives have a little SSD partition with the spinning drive for the rest of the storage. So the operating system and stuff boots up from that SSD and it makes it a lot faster than just a pure spinning disk. Last up is the graphics card. It's a AMD Radeon 555. It's a 2 gigabyte GPU, and it actually performs pretty decently in macOS. They have things optimized really well for that GPU. One thing that's really nice about this machine is the port availability. We have a gigabit Ethernet port, a SD card reader, a headphone jack, 4 USB 3 ports, and 2 USB-C Thunderbolt 3 ports. Now, those Thunderbolt 3 ports are great for external storage and things like that, but they're also great for using an eGPU with this machine. You could buy a cheap eGPU enclosure, throw a beefier video card in there, hook it up, and you're off and running. There's built-in support in Catalina for external GPUs. If you have any other questions about that, I have a video I'll put right up here on using an eGPU with macOS. It's super simple. All right, so let's jump into some synthetic benchmarking. Now, just keep in mind, synthetic benchmarking should not be your final decision on buying a machine. They're good for gauging the performance increase or decrease from one machine to another, but they're done in basically a perfect world scenario, and the performance that you get from a synthetic benchmarking may not be what you see when you actually use the machine. So with that out of the way, let's get into these benchmarking, and the first thing we did was Cinebench. On Cinebench, we got a score of 1252, but Cinebench is showing the processor as a dual core rather than a quad core, so I'm not too confident with those results. Next up is Geekbench. We got a single core score of 818 and a multi-core score of 3035. This is kind of right where I was expecting it. That single core score is not bad. That 7th generation i5 is a pretty decent processor. The multi-core score is also right on par for this processor. Honestly, for pretty much everything I've thrown at this machine, I've not really seen the impact unless we get into some pretty beefy timelines when editing video, but I'll talk about that a little bit more a little later in the video. Last thing I ran was Unigine Heaven to test the GPU performance of this machine. Now, Heaven is one of the older benchmarkings, but I specifically used it because this is not a super powerful GPU. It's just very well optimized in macOS. So with Unigine Heaven set on high at 1080p, we got an average frame per second of 26.6 with a score of 669. Again, not amazing scores, but this wasn't designed to play games or anything like that. When we're talking about the media apps that take use of the optimization of the OS and the optimization within the apps, that score that we got in Heaven doesn't really apply. And that's why I say be so careful when you're looking at these synthetic benchmarkings, because they don't always apply to the actual performance of the machine. So now with the synthetic benchmarking out of the way, let's talk about some real world usage and just day-to-day usage on this machine. The machine's awesome. Things open very fast. You can switch between things quickly. You can have multiple desktops open. Even with just the 8 gigs of RAM, I had multiple tabs in the browser, multiple desktops, and I very rarely, if ever, saw slowdowns with this machine. Everything performed great. Word processing, browsing the web, watching YouTube, all that stuff that you might want to do. I tried it over Ethernet and Wi-Fi. Both worked fantastically. If basic usage is the kind of thing that you're going to be doing with your computer, I can definitely recommend this machine. You can get them for like $600 now, and it performs fantastically. Now, one thing I normally test on my benchmarking videos is gaming, and honestly, I didn't even bother on this machine. It's not a gaming machine. That's not to say you can't play games. You can at a lower resolution and get halfway decent frame rates, but if you're looking for a machine specifically to do gaming, don't consider this machine. Look elsewhere. Last thing I wanted to talk about, and something that I do a lot on whatever machine I'm using, is video editing. I tested Final Cut Pro and DaVinci Resolve 16, and both worked incredibly well. I was very surprised, even with that little bit slower processor. Both work very well with that AMD Radeon 555. You can have complex timelines, do color correction, do multiple layers. Everything worked very, very smoothly, even at the highest resolution, editing 4K right off my camera here, which is MP4 H.264 4K video, which is not a great format for editing, but both applications handled it like a champ with very, very little slowdown. If anything slows down, you can set the viewing resolution a little lower or create proxies. There were some limitations when you had very, very complex timelines. Sometimes things would slow down a little bit, but there are options for improving that. The easiest one is using that GPU like I was talking about, and any of those GPU intensive tasks will be offloaded to that eGPU and get a little bit better performance depending on what graphics card you have in there. Now, there are other options to improve that as well that are a little more complicated, and I'll talk about those in the next section. But I just wanted to talk about exporting and one more benchmark that I ran. So the last benchmark I ran was the Bruce X benchmark, which is a way to benchmark the rendering performance of a machine. And this machine got 37 seconds to render out the whole Bruce X benchmark, which is not bad. If you were to hook up a Thunderbolt 3 drive and an eGPU, you might increase that speed a little bit, but I wanted to do all of these benchmarkings with just the default configuration. All right, so let's get into the upgrades that I was talking about earlier. Now, the easiest ones, like I mentioned before, are an eGPU hooked up by Thunderbolt 3 or an external drive hooked up by Thunderbolt 3. But one thing that's really nice about this machine is you can upgrade the RAM, the storage, and, surprise, surprise, the CPU. This is a socketed CPU on this machine, so you can pop out that i5 7400 and pop in an i7. Now, you have to make sure that you use the same generation of CPU and that it's supported by the machine before you do this. But if you did something like an i7 7700, those are supported. You can upgrade that processor, you can add more RAM and upgrade the storage. You can even put an NVMe drive in here. So that is another video that I'm going to be doing in a few weeks. I have some parts coming in to do that update and then do another test on the performance to see how much additional performance we get out of this machine. I have a feeling after those updates are in here, this thing is going to be a beast. So there you have it. The 2017 base model iMac runs great with Catalina. Day-to-day performance, video editing, even some more complicated tasks work great. Again, if your focus is gaming, you probably want to look elsewhere or do those upgrades that I was talking about before you try gaming on this thing. Now, the upgrades I talked about, obviously you can't upgrade the internal GPU, at least not easily, but the external GPU works great. It's a great solution for that. I'm looking forward to upgrading this thing and seeing how it turns out. Hopefully you are too. If you are, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification button so you know when I put up that video. If you have any questions or comments on anything I talked about, leave those down in the comments section. Also, if you have suggestions on future videos, I'm always open to those as well. Come see me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Love meeting new people over there, and I will see you in the next video.